Привет! This is Piero Giorgio, the author of Survive the Economic Collapse. Today I'm in Geneva, next to the Orthodox Church of Geneva, and I wanted to run a short video to talk to you about what's my feeling and what are my experiences with Russia in terms of economic collapse and how a country, a nation like Russia, will make it or not through the economic collapse. Now, for those of you who've read my book, you know that I talk about the imminence in the next decade because of the convergence of major trends, which are unfortunately not very good, that are going to lead to economic collapse. Of course, there's overpopulation, there's soil depletion, rarity of natural resources, problems with water and arable land, and all of that linked with the financial crisis that is only going to increase. The combination of those crises is going to lead to the collapse of the global economy, at least in my opinion, and I hope I show enough facts for that in the book. And of course, in the book, I explain how people, individuals, communities can build sustainable autonomous bases which will enable you to survive through these difficult times and perhaps build a better world. Now, this approach has to start with the individual. But of course, groups of individuals, even region, and why not, sometimes nations, countries, can make it. Now, there are countries like Switzerland, where I live, who have a culture of making it. Others will have really tough time. So the question is, can Russia make it? So, first of all, to give you some background of what is my experience and why am I even daring to talk about Russia, what do I know about it? Well, first of all, in my personal family, one of my grandfathers, he was in the Italian army during World War II, and when Italy switched sides, as usual, well, he ended up captured by the Germans and ended up in labor camps, in prison, in eastern part of Germany, in the Mercedes power plant. And he was always telling me stories about how he would be bombed by American bombers during the day and British bombers during the night on that factory and so on. Anyway, to make a long story short, he ended up being liberated by the Soviet Red Army in 1945, early 1945. So obviously in the family, we always had his stories on how he actually was very well treated and very happy with the Russian soldiers. They didn't speak the language, but he always was telling me tovarich, and he really liked a lot, to the point that I think all his life he voted for the Italian Communist Party, even if he didn't care what was the program, but certainly by gratitude he did. Anyways, when I was born in the early 70s, so throughout the 70s and 80s, Carter in the U.S. and President Reagan had a strong, animosity, or certainly there was this tension during the Cold War with Brezhnev's Russia, or later on Andropov, Chernenko, or Gorbachev's Russia. And I was, as a little kid and young teenager in the West, completely under the Western propaganda. You know, the West has just as much propaganda as anyone else, as you can notice today. But of course, it was interesting that we were told that the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and communism in general was the evil empire, and it was horrible, and people were starving in the streets in Moscow and couldn't find a piece of bread or a piece of meat, and that it was terrible, and the people were bad, and they wanted to invade Western Europe and rule the world. And that was what we were learning in the media, in the press, and of course we were told that everything the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact countries were telling were lies, and there were, liars, and they were just cunning, and whatever they were doing that seemed interesting was just a cunning plot to take over the world and take over us. Actually, to the point where when I was a teenager, I actually started to have plans to set up underground networks of resistance fighters, just in case Soviet Union would invade Switzerland. I was so silly then. And we were planning to go in the mountains I don't know what we were thinking. We had nothing. We were too young to have rifles and weapons, but we were planning to play, Red Dawn movie in the Swiss mountains. Anyways, so that was my background, and of course, in the 90s, when I graduated from university and started to work, and by the way, had my as a passion of history, I always been very interested in Russian history. So I started to study, of course, 20th century Russian history, the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, the March Revolution, October. Of course, World War I was one of my passion. Russia was a big part of it. World War II I was passionate about World War II, so obviously I started reading David Glant's books, he is one of the experts in the West on the Soviet military system, and I was a sort of semi-expert on Warsaw Pact and Russia and Soviet Union, military power in the 80s. So I have all this weird knowledge still in my mind on the MiG-29s and Soviet T-72 tanks and the organization to the man of the Soviet motorized rifle divisions stationed Eastern Germany in Czech and all those things. Anyways, that's to give you a background. So when I started to work in the 1980s, clearly one of the jobs that I had was at some point to develop emerging markets. So I was led into Eastern Europe and Russia. So I started to work a little bit. I haven't had extensive presence, but certainly I've traveled in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, Omsk, and small other places around those cities to do a little bit of business, and most often to work with local partners. I also even had in the West, actually, a few girlfriends who used to live in Russia and were Russian. One was from Arkhangelsk, others from Moscow. And anyway, I started to learn a little bit the people because I'm of a curious nature. So, interestingly, I first of all, I discovered that Russia is an incredible culture, an incredible country. I started to read a lot of Russian literature. Dostoevsky, of course, Chekhov, and many others, more recent, and even the Soviet 1930, 1940 literature was very interesting. Not only is well written, unfortunately I can't read it in Russian, but the themes and the topics are very interesting to get you to understand the history and the mentality of how people think. It's very different from Western Europe, very different from Americas, and certainly very different from the Mediterranean, and very enjoyable to discover new and different ways of thinking. So clearly, what happened is I started to meet people, discuss, and learn. First of all, I found out that the propaganda about the Soviet Union was not really accurate. Actually, people were not starving. They had some quite enjoyable life. It was not as opulent, as rich, of course, as America, or sometimes even some countries in Western Europe. But certainly, they had some freedom. And even in Eastern Europe, we were told that they were oppressed and they were under total control and economic domination by the Soviet Union. In fact, not so. In fact, it was the Soviet Union who was bankrolling most of the Eastern Europe countries so that they could have a better lifestyle than even Russia. So it was very interesting. Another thing that I learned was that Russia is very tolerant to many communities. In fact, they always would talk in the Western press on how Russians had some right-wing extremists and skinheads, and they were killing Caucasians and blacks and all that. And they were actually turning small events into a big story where, in fact, Russia, even as an institution, is extremely tolerant to Muslims, to minorities, throughout its big size. So I started to learn of that. So that's to give you a context. Now, when we talk about economic collapse, one of the important things to consider is population. Now, Russia today, and of course there has been the big crisis in the 1990s that has led a lot of people to leave. Many left from Israel, a lot of the Jewish Russian people left, and Ukrainians, in fact, left for Israel in the 80s, in the 90s as well. A lot of people moved to the United States and elsewhere in the world. And a lot of rich people moved to London. But certainly, what's interesting is that Russia's population is not very large compared to the size of the country and the potential agriculture and natural resources of the country. So that's a big advantage, is that it's not overpopulated. And in fact, the population has decreased a lot. Now we see natality starting to grow again, and the mortality because of the bad habits of the 80s and certainly of the 90s because of the economic crisis with all this rampant alcoholism, which was true. And I guess people were depressed because of the loss of the hope of the Soviet Union was a big power, and suddenly Russia was in such difficult state. You had all these people turning to black markets, prostitution, all these things to survive, and that puts a lot of bad karma, bad feelings into people, and that was resented. Unfortunately, a lot of people moved to alcoholism, drugs, and therefore mortality increased and natality also decreases. Now that is improving. That is very fortunate, but still it is fairly low populated, and there's lots of natural resources: agriculture, water, wood, forestry, and of course the natural resources in the soil. Of course, there's oil, gas, uranium, everything is present in Russia. So strategically, and Russians are great strategic thinkers, strategically Russia is perfectly set up to be completely autonomous, to be a gigantic, sustainable, autonomous base. And this is very, very, very positive for people living in Russia. In fact, I know some customers of mine, I do consulting for fairly wealthy people who try to understand how they can change their habits or configure the way of life, including their houses and etc., to set themselves up as sustainable, autonomous bases. Well, some of these people actually, from even Switzerland, plan to move to Russia. And I have some Russian customers in London who actually are planning to sell everything in London because they understood that London is not going to be sustainable, and they move back to Russia. Some even in the Altai Mountains in the east. So very, very great place to be sustainable and to have the energy to withstand the economic collapse and economic crisis. So infrastructure is there for that. Now, the other element is culture. When there is a crisis, are Russians, like other countries in the world, just going in the street and pillaging and rampaging and raping? And history shows us that this is not the case. When Russia has some emergency, as long as the government remains structured, Russians have a sense of patriotism, a sense of belonging to the motherland, the country, and even whether they're Orthodox, Muslim, or from other minorities, or even without God, atheists, they stick to the land and they have a sense of patriotism. That is a very, very important asset in times of difficulty. And they also went through so many crises. They went through the Tsar, the end of the Tsarism system for their grandfathers, and through the revolution, and through so many difficult times. World War II was abysmal, was rough in Russia. So this was, of course, something that came into the mind and the culture of people, that they survived through tough times. During the Soviet system, and yes, I'll say it, the economic system of a centralized government-run state, it's completely wrong in my opinion. And doesn't matter if I'm right or wrong, it doesn't work very well. Still, they allowed people to have their own plot of land, to grow their vegetables, to grow their fruits, and have some little animals so that they could have food. And this is what saved them when the state collapses. Imagine in 1990, 1991, 92, and the following years, suddenly the state, which ran almost everything, collapsed, was not there anymore. So were people relying on that? Well, of course, and they couldn't find jobs. They were not paid. The soldiers and the government workers were not paid anymore. So people had to go to start businesses, but there were no culture and infrastructure of that. Fortunately, in terms of food and water and drinking, well, they had their little plots of land in the cities, outside the cities, because that was strong in the culture, and they could survive because of that. And that gives Russian people in general a sense of the reality that, sure, now it's great, and you go in Moscow, you have traffic full of BMWs and Mercedes and Ferraris and Maseratis and Bentleys, but behind all that, they have a sense of reality. you need to have your food, you need to have your water, you need to have the factor sticking together against maybe an enemy or against chaos. And that is a strong, strong cultural element that will make Russia extremely apt to survive the economic collapse. Anyways, to conclude, Russia, country that I really admire, that I love, that I estimate. It's great people, very smart, very interesting. I have lots to learn. I would be happy to go back, and I will go back again. If you know a publisher in Russian, of course, I would love to get my book translated, my books in fact, translated in Russian language. And of course, do some conferences in Moscow and St. Petersburg, as I do across the world, in France, Switzerland, and in the United States, and soon in Italy. So clearly, I am very positive, and I'm not saying this for many countries. I'm not positive for Western Europe. I'm not positive for most of the United States. I'm not positive for most of the countries around the world. But I am confident that if Russia does the right things, and if it has great leadership, which it does today, it does have smart and stable and strong and good leadership, well, Russia can make it, and so will Russian people. So take care from Geneva. Das vidania. I'll speak to you soon. Ciao.